Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we journey back to a time of fear, mystery, and sudden loss. Together, we will explore the story of the sweating sickness, a shadow darker than even the Black Death. Allow yourself to relax as we wander through history, witnessing resilience amid terror. Breathe deeply and let the story carry you into the echoes of a world long past. The year was 1485, and the fields of England were still damp with the echoes of war. The land had just witnessed the Battle of Bosworth, the violent clash that ended the long and bitter Wars of the Roses, a civil struggle that had torn apart families and rival houses for decades. The crown had passed to Henry Tudor, who emerged victorious, standing upon the battlefield where Richard III had fallen. There must have been, in those days, a sense of uneasy relief among the people, the feeling that perhaps the land would at last know peace, that blood would no longer flow so freely, that families could return to farming, to trade, and to rebuilding their broken lives. But even as the swords were sheathed and the banners furled, something else, unseen and more terrifying than any army, began to drift through the air of England. A new enemy had arrived, one that could not be defeated with steel or cunning, one that even kings and generals had no defense against. It came silently, like a shadow that lengthened without warning. This was the beginning of what would come to be called the sweating sickness. Its arrival was as sudden as it was bewildering. There were no long months of rumors, no gradual spread from distant lands as there had been with earlier plagues. Instead, it seemed to appear as if out of nothing. One day, people were going about their lives, rebuilding after war, trading in markets, celebrating the dawn of a new reign. And then, without warning, men began to fall ill in a way no one had ever seen before. A chill would seize the body, a tremor that no fire could warm, a coldness that penetrated to the very bone. This was the first sign, though at the time no one could have recognized it as such. A man might shiver in the early morning and believe he had merely caught the damp of the night air, but within moments the coldness gave way to fever. The body, moments before freezing, now burned as if lit from within. The heart began to pound with an unnatural speed, and sweat broke out across the skin, not a light sheen as in ordinary fevers, but torrents, rivers, as if the body were trying to drown itself from within. The sweat poured so heavily that clothing became soaked, bedding was drenched, floors beneath the sick grew slick and dangerous. The odor, too, was said to be unbearable, a sour, suffocating smell that filled rooms and clung to those who nursed the dying. And then came dizziness, confusion, unbearable anxiety. Victims grew restless, unable to lie still, tossing and turning, their minds gripped by a sense of doom. Some cried out in delirium, others lay silent, staring at the ceiling as their breaths grew shallow. And most chilling of all was the speed, for while many diseases of the age lingered for days or weeks, giving some chance of hope or prayer, this new sickness did not tarry. Death often came in less than a day. In many cases, it came within mere hours. Imagine, for a moment, the terror of such a reality. A man might wake in the morning strong and healthy, laughing with his family over breakfast. By noon, he might feel the first tremors of chill, dismissing them as nothing more than fatigue. By afternoon, he would be drenched in sweat, trembling with fear, and by evening he might be dead, his body carried out of the house and buried hastily in the earth. There was no time for priests to prepare last rites, no time for farewells, no time even for neighbors to realize what had occurred. Death swept in as swiftly as a storm, striking down the young and the strong with the same ease as the weak and elderly. At first, people did not know what to call it. They had seen pestilences before. The Black Death, a century earlier, had carved its wounds across Europe, leaving half of some towns lying cold in mass graves. That plague was recognized by its blackened swellings, its gradual wasting, its slow but merciless grip. But this was different. There were no buboes, no days of warning, no recognizable signs except for the sweat that poured from every pore. Physicians, helpless as always in those days, attempted to describe it in their writings. They noted the sudden chill, the rapid fever, the sweat, the difficulty of breathing, the overwhelming fatigue. Yet even their descriptions could not fully capture the horror of how quickly it struck, and so it gained its name, the sweating sickness, or the sweating plague. To call it by such a simple name may make it sound almost harmless to us now, as though it were nothing more than a fever that left one damp and uncomfortable, but to those who lived through it, the very mention of the sweat was enough to chill the blood. For it was not the sweat itself that killed, but the unseen force that caused it, a force no one could understand or fight. In a world that already believed disease to be the punishment of God or the result of poisoned air, the sweating sickness seemed like proof that death could come not in days or weeks, but in hours, with no mercy, no explanation, and no escape. The spread of this disease was as puzzling as its symptoms. It did not follow the same paths as the plague, which often clung to the poor, the crowded, the hungry. Instead, the sweating sickness seemed to prefer the wealthy, the noble, those who lived in fine houses and served in royal courts. This alone set it apart and made it more terrifying, for what comfort was there in riches or power if such things only drew death closer? Stories circulated of noble households, struck in the morning, reduced to silence by night. Whole families vanished in a single day. Kings and queens trembled, realizing that even the crown itself offered no defense. Henry Tudor himself, fresh upon his throne, must have looked at this sudden scourge with dread, for he had won a kingdom through blood and battle, only to face an enemy far more dangerous than any army. The people of England had no defenses against such a thing. Medicine, as it was then understood, was more ritual than science. Physicians bled patients, seeking to balance their humors. They burned herbs in the streets to cleanse the air, believing that foul smells carried disease. They offered prayers, charms, and potions, yet none of these efforts made the slightest difference. Once the sweat took hold, there was little anyone could do but wait and pray, and more often than not, the prayer went unanswered. Consider how such a disease must have reshaped daily life. A man who felt a chill in the morning could not know whether it was simply the coolness of dawn or the beginning of his final day. Families who saw a son or daughter begin to sweat had no time to gather loved ones, no time to prepare for mourning, no time to brace themselves. The speed of the illness tore away not only lives, but the rituals of death that gave meaning to loss. Burials were hasty, often within hours, sometimes without ceremony, for fear the illness would spread. Grief had no time to settle. It was pushed aside by the urgency of survival. The fear of the sweat ran deeper than numbers. The Black Death, for all its horror, gave people something to see, something to dread. The swellings, the coughs, the stench of the infected made it visible, almost tangible, but the sweating sickness struck invisibly. A healthy man at dawn could be a corpse by night. There was no way to prepare, no time to flee, no sign to warn of danger. In many ways, this invisibility made it feel more like a curse than a sickness, as if death itself walked the streets unseen, choosing its victims at random. And so, in the autumn of 1485, England found itself living under a new kind of shadow. The war was over, but peace had not truly come. A king wore the crown, but even he could not command this enemy. The sweat was everywhere and nowhere, striking one household and sparing the next, leaving no explanation behind. It was not only the poor who feared, nor only the rich. It was everyone, everywhere, all at once. The chronicles of the time do not give us numbers as precise as we might wish. Historians can only guess at how many died in those first outbreaks. Some say thousands, others tens of thousands, but numbers matter less than the memory it left. For those who survived, the horror of the sweating sickness was not only in how many it claimed, but in how quickly, how mercilessly, how silently. If you imagine walking through a London street in those days, you might see merchants selling their wares in the morning sun, children running, laughing, their voices bright in the air, a nobleman in his fine garments passing by, nodding to his servants, and by evening half those same faces would be gone. Doors would be closed, shutters drawn, the laughter silenced. A hush would fall over the city, broken only by the sound of carts carrying away the dead. The smell of sweat and fear would hang heavy in the night air. And behind each closed door, families would wait in silence, listening for the sound of a cough, the rustle of sheets, the dreaded signs that the sickness had entered their home. In such an atmosphere, even health became a fragile illusion. No one could feel truly safe, for the sickness gave no time for safety. Every moment of strength was a moment borrowed, every heart beat a reminder of how quickly life could end. And this knowledge, this constant awareness of fragility, was perhaps the cruelest symptom of all. Thus began the reign of the sweating sickness, a reign not marked by armies or crowns, but by fear. It came suddenly, it killed swiftly, and it left nothing but silence in its wake. The people of England, newly freed from war, now lived in the grip of an invisible enemy, one that showed no mercy, one that could not be seen, one that drenched them in sweat and carried them off before they had even had time to whisper farewell. And though centuries have passed, though the sickness has vanished into mystery, the memory of those first outbreaks still lingers in the pages of history, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying enemies are not the ones we can fight, but the ones that come silently, strike swiftly, and leave us with only questions. The memory of plague was still fresh in the minds of Europe. A little more than a century earlier, the Black Death had rolled through towns and villages like a storm cloud that would not lift. People had watched as neighbors developed the swollen buboes, the dark patches of skin, the coughing, the gradual wasting away. They had listened to the bells toll endlessly, seen the carts piled with bodies, smelt the stench of mass graves where thousands were buried together. That was horror enough, but it was a horror people had come to recognize. They could look upon a sick man and see the signs of plague. They could sense its arrival. They could prepare for the possibility of death. Terrifying though it was, the Black Death gave its victims a cruel sort of warning, a visible and familiar enemy. The sweating sickness, however, was something altogether different, and for that reason it was often said to be worse. It offered no time, no warning, no gradual decline. Death came as suddenly as a storm at sea. A man might rise in the morning, strong, well-fed, and full of plans, and by the setting of the sun he was already cold in his grave. Families who thought themselves secure found their lives torn apart in the span of a few hours. Servants collapsed in kitchens, merchants behind their stalls, noblemen in their courts, all brought low by the same invisible hand. What made it more unsettling was the way it seemed to defy the rules people had come to expect of disease. The Black Death had largely spared the rich. It was the poor, the crowded, the malnourished who died in greatest numbers, while nobles behind their stone walls often had better odds of survival. But the sweating sickness appeared to prefer the wealthy, the well-fed, those with fine homes and soft beds. Entire households of nobility vanished in the course of a single day, leaving behind silent estates, unanswered questions, and the eerie impression that the disease had deliberately chosen its victims. Some whispered that the sickness was divine punishment sent to humble the mighty. Others said it came from the corruption of the air, a miasma that sought out those who lived in luxury. Whatever the cause, its habit of striking the privileged classes only deepened the terror. For if even the great could fall so quickly, what hope was there for anyone? Priests were helpless before it. When the plague had come, priests at least could walk among the sick, giving the final blessings, whispering the prayers for the dying. It was a grim task, but one that gave comfort to the living and dignity to the dead. The sweating sickness made even this impossible. A man might be alive and speaking one moment, and dead the next, his lips silenced before a single prayer could be finished. Often, by the time a priest arrived, there was no one left to save, no words left to be said. To die without last rites was a fate many in those days feared as much as death itself, and the sweating sickness robbed thousands of that final comfort. Physicians, too, were rendered useless. Their methods, bleeding the patient, purging with emetics, mixing herbs into potions, were as ineffective as trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. They recommended cold rooms for some, hot rooms for others, wrapping the sick in blankets to sweat out the illness, or stripping them bare to keep them cool. None of it mattered. The disease laughed at all efforts, sweeping through households with the same speed and cruelty. When patients recovered, it was by chance alone, and doctors, though eager to claim credit, could not deny that more often than not, those who entered their care never returned. This helplessness added to the terror. It is one thing to suffer when there are cures that sometimes succeed, another to fall ill knowing no human hand can help you. And so, the sweating sickness seemed not like an illness but a visitation, a punishment beyond human comprehension. To breathe was to risk it, to eat, to drink, to sleep. There was no safety in strength, no security in wealth, no shield in faith. What unsettled people even more was the speed with which it overturned daily life. A noble household that bustled with servants and laughter in the morning could be empty by night. The master dead in his bedchamber, the mistress collapsed in her chair, the children gone before they had time to cry out. Servants abandoned their posts, fleeing into the countryside, hoping to escape the unseen curse, but it followed them. Travelers carried it to new towns, where it flared up again, burning through communities before vanishing as suddenly as it had come. It left behind not only the grief of lost lives, but the disorientation of power suddenly shifted. When nobles perished, estates were thrown into chaos, titles passed unexpectedly to distant relatives. Lands were left without heirs. In some cases, entire lines of families were extinguished. The sweating sickness did not just kill individuals. It reshaped society by removing those who held power, creating vacuums that were filled by others, often changing the course of history in quiet but profound ways. The fear of this new affliction seeped into every corner of life. It was said that men who once laughed loudly now spoke in whispers, afraid of attracting the attention of death. Doors were closed against visitors, shutters drawn even in daylight. Towns fell silent as markets emptied and churches grew bare. And within households, families waited, listening for the dreaded signs. The sudden shiver, the restless tossing in bed, the first drops of sweat that meant the end was near. To live under such conditions was to feel as though every breath might be the last, as though every moment of peace was stolen from the jaws of death. And unlike the plague, which carried a grim familiarity, the sweating sickness was an enigma. No one knew why it came or why it left, why it chose one man and spared another. Its mystery made it more frightening, for what cannot be understood cannot be resisted. There are accounts of men waking in good cheer, drinking with friends, only to be dead before the sun had fully set. Stories of brides and grooms collapsing on their wedding day, of soldiers returning from victory only to be claimed before they could celebrate, of children who seemed full of energy in the morning and lay still by nightfall. Each story added to the growing sense that the sweating sickness was not bound by any rule, not answerable to prayer or medicine, but a force that arrived and departed at will, like some malevolent spirit haunting the land. The terror was compounded by the knowledge that this was not an isolated incident, but a recurring one. The sickness would strike in waves, then vanish, leaving people to wonder when it would return. Each quiet year was not peace but suspense, each outbreak a grim reminder that safety was only an illusion, and because it killed so swiftly, there was no sense of progression, no gradual increase or decline. One day, there was no sickness. The next, hundreds lay dead. One week, the city hummed with trade and laughter. The next, it was as though a great shadow had fallen, muffling every sound, silencing every joy. To compare it with the Black Death, therefore, is to weigh different kinds of horror. The Black Death was vast, sweeping across continents, leaving devastation in its wake. Its numbers dwarfed those of the sweating sickness. But its horror was slow, visible, familiar in its grim pattern. The sweating sickness was small by comparison, but it was sharp, sudden, unpredictable. It was like the difference between a storm that floods an entire valley and a lightning strike that kills without warning. The storm may destroy more, but the lightning inspires a different, more intimate kind of fear. Those who lived through it often said it was worse than plague, not because it claimed more lives, but because it offered less mercy. Death in the Black Death came with days of suffering, time for prayers, farewells, last embraces. The sweating sickness robbed all of that. It snatched away fathers before children could say goodbye. It carried off mothers before their families could gather. It silenced laughter before it even had time to echo. It was not just a disease, but a thief, stealing time itself. Imagine a noble banquet in Tudor England, the long tables laden with meats and breads, the goblets filled with wine, the music playing in the background. Laughter echoes as lords and ladies speak of politics, of marriage, of alliances. And then, suddenly, one of them grows pale. A chill passes over him. Sweat beads upon his brow. Within hours he is dead, and the banquet has turned into a funeral. That was the kind of scene the sweating sickness left behind, and those who witnessed it could never forget. For the poor, it was a reminder that death respected no boundary. For the rich, it was a shattering of the illusion of safety. For all, it was a lesson in how fragile life could be. And though centuries have passed, though the sweating sickness has vanished from the earth without explanation, its memory lingers in the chronicles, in the fearful words of those who saw it. They tell us of a terror that struck faster than any sword, of a death that gave no warning, of a sickness that, for many, felt worse than the plague itself. Cities and towns that had once thrived with the clatter of markets, the hum of craftsmen at their work, the chatter of neighbors across narrow streets, found themselves under an oppressive silence when the sweating sickness arrived. It was not merely an illness that claimed bodies. It was a shadow that claimed the very rhythm of daily life. The disease moved with a speed and unpredictability that no one could anticipate. A street bustling with merchants and children could be almost deserted within hours, as the invisible threat silently wove its way into homes, inns, and workplaces. People quickly learned that fleeing the city offered no real safety, for the sickness often traveled faster than the travelers themselves, spreading along the very roads they hoped would carry them to refuge. London, the heart of Tudor England, became a focal point for this terror. It was a city of narrow alleys, timbered homes stacked closely together, and open-air markets teeming with life. It was also a city ripe for disease, where the mixing of rich and poor, the crowded streets, and the lack of sanitation created the perfect conditions for contagion. When the sweating sickness struck, it did so with such suddenness that it seemed to appear in the very air, seeping through windows, doors, and chimneys, claiming victims regardless of status or age. The chroniclers of the time wrote of whole households disappearing in a single night, of servants dying beside their masters, of children vanishing from beds while parents watched helplessly. There was no rhyme or reason to who lived and who died, which made every shadow, every cough, every shiver in a neighbor's home a potential harbinger of death. The reaction of the populace was a mix of terror and desperation. Merchants closed their shops, fearing that every coin exchanged might carry death. Inns that had once been filled with travelers became ghostly, their doors shut against visitors, their kitchens quiet. Churches, which had long been places of solace and community, emptied as parishioners feared that the very act of entering a building might expose them to the disease. Bells no longer rang for festivals or celebrations. Instead, they tolled in warning, though often too late to save those already afflicted. Fear became the invisible governor of daily life, dictating where people could go, what they could do, and even whom they could touch. Within the homes themselves, families were gripped by a suffocating anxiety. Mothers watched over their children with wide-eyed vigilance. Brothers and sisters hesitated to enter each other's chambers, and fathers paced the floors in quiet despair, listening for the telltale signs, the sudden tremor, the restless tossing in bed, the glistening sweat that heralded imminent death. The psychological toll was enormous. It was not just the possibility of losing loved ones, but the unpredictability of the illness that created a constant state of vigilance and dread. No one could rest fully. No one could trust the morning light to bring a safe day. Every heartbeat became a reminder of mortality, every whispered cough a potential death sentence. The social structure of towns and cities began to fray under this relentless pressure. Servants abandoned their masters, fleeing into the countryside, hoping that distance would shield them. Yet, even in rural areas, reports of the sickness followed, carried along the roads by travelers, merchants, and displaced villagers. Estates were left unattended, fields went untilled, and the economy faltered as trade slowed and commerce halted. Markets emptied, artisans stayed home, and the wheels of society creaked to a near halt. Every outbreak left behind not only the bodies of the dead, but the paralysis of those who survived, a lingering fear that persisted long after the immediate danger had passed. One of the most unnerving aspects of the sweating sickness was its suddenness and randomness. Unlike plagues that seemed to spread steadily, creeping from village to town, from town to city, this disease would erupt in a single place, burn fiercely for a brief period, and then vanish just as mysteriously. A city might spend weeks or months in near-perfect health, only for the sickness to reappear without warning, striking down new victims with the same relentless swiftness. Chroniclers of the time described these outbreaks almost like fires that ignited without spark, consuming all in their path and then disappearing as if by magic. There was no warning, no pattern, and no way to predict its arrival, which made every calm day a deceptive illusion. The psychological impact on communities was profound. People spoke in hushed tones of the shadow that walks the streets, a presence that could not be seen but could be felt in every glance, every footstep, every door left slightly ajar. Children learned to fear the night, for it was often during the late hours that the first tremors of the illness became apparent. The elderly whispered of curses and divine punishment, recalling tales of pestilence from generations past, while the learned and educated sought explanations in the air, the water, or the alignment of the heavens. None of these theories offered any real comfort, for the sickness did not respond to reason or ritual. It was indiscriminate, unstoppable, and terrifying in its simplicity. Hospitals and physicians, already strained by prior outbreaks of disease, were overwhelmed. Treatments were improvised and often contradictory. Some recommended warmth, blankets, and heavy meals to strengthen the body, while others advised fasting, cool rooms, and purging. Families turned to home remedies, herbal concoctions, and prayers in desperation. Yet all were largely ineffective. The disease did not linger long enough for medicine to take effect. Its speed was its most terrifying weapon, leaving no time for intervention, no opportunity for recovery, no possibility of preparation. Physicians wrote of their frustrations, noting that even their most diligent efforts could not stem the tide. They recorded the symptoms, the sudden onset, the drowning sweat, the rapid demise, yet these records were as much a testament to the horror of the illness as they were to the science of medicine at the time. Travelers unwittingly became carriers, spreading the illness from city to city, town to town. A merchant leaving London might arrive in a neighboring market with nothing more than a mild chill or a bead of sweat, and within hours the disease would erupt in a new location, claiming lives before anyone understood its source. This rapid and almost invisible transmission added another layer of fear. No distance was safe. No place could claim immunity. Even those who fled the cities for the open fields or quiet villages found themselves not entirely free. Rumors of outbreaks traveled as quickly as the disease itself, reaching remote settlements and filling them with dread. In the midst of these outbreaks, entire social orders could be overturned in the span of days. When nobles or heads of households perished, estates were left leaderless, lands went untended, and titles passed unexpectedly to distant relatives. The sudden deaths created vacuums of power, leading to disputes over inheritance and authority. In some cases, the unexpected deaths of rulers or influential figures altered political trajectories, forcing changes in alliances, marriages, and governance. The sweating sickness, in its silent, invisible way, reshaped the very fabric of society, not only by claiming lives, but by shifting power and influence with startling speed. It was not only the speed and randomness that terrified people, but also the way the illness rendered traditional coping mechanisms useless. Communities could not quarantine effectively because no one could know who was infected until it was too late. Religious rituals, which often provided comfort in times of crisis, offered little solace. Even prayers, which had been thought to protect from plagues or divine wrath, seemed impotent in the face of this swift killer. People were left to confront an almost unimaginable reality: the certainty of mortality, with none of the preparation they had once relied upon. The societal response was therefore a mixture of avoidance, panic, and superstition. Houses were abandoned in fear. Streets grew quiet, almost unnaturally so. Markets, which had once been vibrant with chatter and the sound of coin, fell silent. Some communities resorted to extreme measures, isolating the sick, burning clothing and bedding, and avoiding contact with outsiders. Yet these measures, while understandable, were only partially effective, and they could not prevent the disease from flaring again in another town or village. The pervasive sense of helplessness only deepened the collective anxiety. Stories of individual tragedies multiplied. Chroniclers wrote of families wiped out in a single night, of merchants found dead in their shops, of children who never woke from what seemed to be a minor chill. There were accounts of noblemen succumbing in their beds while their servants, having fled, watched helplessly from outside. Some chroniclers described whole streets emptied of life, the silence broken only by the distant sound of funeral bells, and the hurried shoveling of earth into graves. Each story reinforced the belief that the sweating sickness was not merely a disease, but an unpredictable force, a shadow that could fall on any household at any moment. And yet, despite its terror, life continued in the gaps between outbreaks. People rebuilt, reopened shops, tended their fields, and resumed daily routines, even as the memory of sudden death lingered. The cyclical nature of the disease created a strange rhythm in society, periods of panic and mourning followed by brief stretches of normality, only to be disrupted again by another wave. In these periods of calm, people developed rituals of vigilance, monitoring the faintest signs of illness and preparing for the possibility that life could be snatched away in a single day. The randomness of survival added a further psychological burden. Some who were exposed remained healthy while neighbors succumbed. Some children survived while parents perished. There was no pattern, no logic, no fairness. The randomness of the disease made it seem almost sentient, a force that chose its victims according to rules no human could discern. The uncertainty compounded fear, for it meant that no one could feel truly safe, regardless of status, wealth, or proximity to others. By the time a wave of the sweating sickness had passed, communities were left not only with grief for the dead, but with an enduring sense of vulnerability. People spoke in hushed tones of the shadow that walks, of a death that could strike anyone at any time. Children grew up with stories of sudden illness. Adults carried a constant awareness of fragility, and even those who survived bore scars of anxiety, grief, and uncertainty. The disease's legacy was thus as much psychological as it was physical, shaping the way people thought, lived, and interacted for generations. By the time people began to truly understand the devastation wrought by the sweating sickness, a sense of helplessness had settled over England and the surrounding regions. It was not only the speed and unpredictability of death that terrified the population, but also the way in which the disease seemed to mock the very structures that had once provided security. Whereas the Black Death had been slow, methodical, and visible, the sweating sickness struck suddenly, often targeting those who believed themselves most safe. Nobles, kings, wealthy merchants, and even clergy were brought low within hours. The very institutions that had once promised protection, the fortifications of castles, the supposed wisdom of physicians, the comfort of religious ritual, proved utterly powerless. People began to ask themselves, in quiet whispers, whether the disease was worse than the plague, and many concluded that, in its swiftness and randomness, it was indeed more terrifying. Consider the daily reality of living under such a shadow. A nobleman might rise in the morning to hear reports from his steward, check the accounts of his lands, and meet with his household staff. By midday, he could be sweating uncontrollably, shivering despite the warmth of the room, his heart racing and his breath shallow. Servants, unsure of how to care for him or fearing for their own lives, might flee, leaving him alone with the sickness. By evening, the man could be dead, and the house plunged into mourning before anyone had fully grasped what had happened. These sudden deaths disrupted not only families but the very operation of estates, creating chaos in a world that depended heavily on hierarchy, labor, and order. The unpredictability of survival intensified the fear. In one household, a father might die while his child remained untouched. In another, a servant might fall while the master survived. No precautions seemed to offer protection. No method could ensure safety. People began to see death not as a distant possibility, but as an ever-present companion, something that could arrive at any moment and in any place. This constant awareness of mortality reshaped behavior, instilling both caution and paranoia. Streets grew emptier, neighbors avoided each other, and even family members sometimes kept their distance, afraid that proximity might invite the sickness. The disease also had profound effects on the political and social order. When nobles died suddenly, estates were left leaderless, and legal disputes over inheritance erupted. Distant relatives might find themselves elevated to positions of power they had never expected, while those who had long awaited succession were cut off entirely by the rapid advance of the sickness. In some cases, entire lines of families were extinguished, and with them went the stability and influence they had provided to towns, cities, and regions. Kings, aware of the fragility of life, were forced to reconsider their security, their alliances, and their governance. Henry Roman VIII himself, though young and vigorous, fled London on more than one occasion, fearing that even royal protection could not shield him from the sweat. Such fears were not unfounded. The disease had no regard for status, wealth, or military might. The psychological toll on communities was immense. The randomness and rapidity of death created an environment of constant vigilance. Children learned to fear illness before they understood it. Adults spoke in hushed tones about symptoms, and the elderly remembered the suffering of past outbreaks while fearing the recurrence of the same fate. Even in moments of calm, people were alert to the slightest tremor, the faintest chill, the first drops of sweat that could indicate the arrival of the disease. Life became a delicate balance between hope and terror, with no guarantees that one could enjoy a single day without facing the specter of sudden death. Society, in its attempt to cope, adapted in strange and sometimes tragic ways. Families would isolate themselves, often cutting off all contact with neighbors and even relatives. Markets and public spaces were abandoned, trade slowed to a crawl, and towns became eerily quiet as the population withdrew into private homes. Religious observances, once central to daily life, were disrupted as people feared gathering in churches. Rituals intended to provide comfort in times of crisis lost their efficacy, as prayers, blessings, and processions seemed powerless against a disease that struck and departed at will. People turned to superstition, believing that curses, poisoned air, or divine wrath were at the root of the sickness. Yet even these explanations offered little real consolation. The rapidity of death meant that traditional responses to illness were largely obsolete. Physicians could attempt remedies, but the disease often ran its course too quickly for any treatment to have effect. Families were forced to care for the sick without guidance, improvising as best they could. Herbs were boiled, compresses applied, prayers whispered, and yet the mortality rate remained high. Chroniclers noted the frustration of doctors and the despair of those who witnessed the collapse of loved ones in mere hours. This sense of helplessness contributed to an almost pervasive dread that lingered long after the immediate outbreak had passed. In addition to personal fear, the sweating sickness disrupted economic life. Merchants, who once traveled freely to trade goods, hesitated to leave their homes, fearing infection. Inns and taverns were closed. Empty streets reduced commerce to a fraction of its former activity, and markets suffered as people avoided public gatherings. The labor force was destabilized, with workers dying suddenly and leaving essential tasks unfinished. Fields went untilled, shops remained shuttered, and the normal rhythm of life was thrown into disarray. Each wave of the disease left communities not only grieving, but struggling to rebuild their social and economic foundations. The disease also carried an air of mystery that amplified its psychological impact. Unlike the plague, which had identifiable signs and a known progression, the sweating sickness was unpredictable in its symptoms and course. People did not know why some survived while others perished, why certain families were spared while neighbors were decimated. The lack of understanding fostered an environment of suspicion and fear. Some attributed the illness to poisoned wells or tainted air, others to the wrath of God, and still others to secret plots or magical forces. This uncertainty intensified the sense of vulnerability, as no one could predict or prevent its occurrence. Survival seemed arbitrary. Reports from chroniclers describe entire households struck down in hours, while those in neighboring homes remained untouched. Children might be spared while their parents perished, and individuals who appeared weak or ill could recover while the strong succumbed. This randomness created a collective anxiety that touched every aspect of life. People began to avoid gatherings, fearing that proximity to others could invite infection. Social bonds, which had been central to community cohesion, were strained as individuals prioritized self-preservation over companionship. The recurring nature of the outbreaks created a rhythm of dread. Communities would experience periods of relative calm, only to be disrupted by sudden resurgence. These cycles of disease shaped the social consciousness, teaching people to live with a constant, underlying awareness of mortality. Preparations became routine. Households stocked supplies, families established isolation practices, and towns erected rudimentary quarantine measures. Yet the effectiveness of these precautions was limited by the speed and unpredictability of the disease, reinforcing the notion that control was an illusion and that life remained fragile and uncertain. Amidst the fear, chroniclers documented the experiences of individuals and families in painstaking detail. They recorded sudden collapses, intense fevers, and drenching sweats, along with the emotional turmoil of those who witnessed these events. Families were left in grief without ceremony, neighbors were traumatized by the sudden loss of friends, and communities struggled to comprehend the rapid turnover of life and death. These accounts provide a haunting picture of a society gripped not only by illness, but by the psychological weight of constant vigilance and fear. Even the physical environment of cities and towns seemed altered by the presence of the disease. Streets emptied, homes were shuttered, markets lay quiet, and public spaces became desolate. The very rhythm of daily life shifted to accommodate the ever-present threat. Children played less openly, artisans worked cautiously, and families remained close to home. In these moments, the psychological and physical impact of the disease were intertwined, creating a pervasive atmosphere of tension and unease. The mortality caused by the sweating sickness also had long-term consequences for population structure and demographics. Sudden deaths of adults in their prime left many children orphaned, families destabilized, and economic systems strained. The loss of labor disrupted agricultural production and urban trade, while the deaths of nobles and local leaders could shift political power dramatically. Entire regions could experience social upheaval due to the abrupt removal of key individuals from society, leaving a legacy of instability that persisted long after the immediate outbreak had subsided. Despite these challenges, people adapted. They developed rituals, strategies, and superstitions to cope with the ever-present threat. Some families implemented strict isolation practices, keeping the sick apart from the healthy. Others relied on herbal remedies, spiritual guidance, and protective charms. These measures, while often ineffective in halting the disease, provided psychological comfort and a sense of agency. Communities learned to balance caution with continuity, maintaining essential functions even as fear shaped daily behavior. In this environment of unpredictability, the human imagination flourished in ways both practical and fantastical. Stories of miraculous survivals, sudden deaths, and inexplicable recoveries circulated widely, shaping collective memory and social norms. People interpreted these events through the lens of religion, superstition, and emerging scientific thought, attempting to make sense of an illness that defied comprehension. The unpredictability of survival and the randomness of mortality reinforced the sense that life was fragile, fleeting, and constantly at risk. Even as the disease passed from one location to another, its memory lingered. Communities bore the scars of grief, trauma, and disruption long after the immediate threat had faded. The psychological imprint of sudden, arbitrary death shaped social behavior, family structures, and communal rituals for generations. The sweating sickness, though transient in its appearance, left an enduring legacy in the collective consciousness, a reminder of the fragility of life and the ever-present potential for sudden catastrophe. As the waves of the sweating sickness ebbed and flowed across England, people began to recognize patterns not in the illness itself, which remained unpredictable, but in the human response to it. Life, though disrupted, persisted. Families rebuilt after losses, markets reopened, and towns attempted to return to a semblance of normalcy, all while carrying the heavy knowledge that at any moment, death could strike again. This awareness transformed both individual behavior and the collective mindset of communities. The ordinary routines of life became infused with caution, mindfulness, and an almost ritualized vigilance as people sought to protect themselves from an enemy that could not be seen, could not be reasoned with, and could not be held at bay by wealth or power. One of the most remarkable aspects of these years was the resilience of ordinary people. Farmers returned to their fields despite the uncertainty, tending to crops and livestock that were essential for survival. Merchants reopened shops and markets, even knowing that each transaction might bring them into contact with the invisible threat. Families gathered once more in homes, sharing meals and stories, teaching children to navigate a world in which safety was never guaranteed. This perseverance was not born of ignorance, but of necessity and courage. To live in those times was to accept that fragility was part of existence, and yet life had to continue. The psychological strategies people employed to cope with the sweating sickness were varied and often inventive. Some families adopted strict isolation measures, keeping the sick apart from the healthy and limiting interaction with outsiders. Others relied on protective rituals, burning herbs, hanging charms, and invoking prayers, seeking comfort in practices that might not have prevented illness but provided a measure of control in a chaotic world. Social interactions were carefully managed. Neighbors greeted one another cautiously, conversations were brief, and gatherings were minimized. The very fabric of community life shifted, prioritizing survival over tradition, caution over familiarity. These adaptations, though imperfect, illustrate the human capacity to endure in the face of relentless uncertainty. People developed routines for monitoring symptoms, caring for the ill, and maintaining hygiene in ways that were rudimentary but effective for reducing exposure. Children learned from their elders the signs to watch for, the precautions to take, and the behaviors to avoid. Even in the absence of scientific understanding, these practical lessons spread through communities, creating a form of shared knowledge and collective vigilance that helped some survive the unpredictable waves of illness. At the same time, the social and political consequences of the sweating sickness continued to unfold. The sudden deaths of nobles, merchants, and community leaders created vacuums of authority and wealth, leading to disputes over inheritance, leadership, and property. Estates left unattended sometimes fell into decay, while political alliances were reshaped by the unexpected deaths of influential figures. Kings and regional rulers, confronted by the vulnerability of even the high-ranking individuals, had to reconsider their security measures, travel cautiously, and plan for contingencies that had previously seemed unnecessary. The disease had the power not only to take lives but to reshape the very structure of society, shifting power and influence in ways that could have long long-term consequences. Beyond the immediate impact on leadership and property, the sweating sickness had a profound effect on cultural practices and social behavior. Fear of sudden illness influenced patterns of work, leisure, and family interaction. Religious observances were altered. Processions, festivals, and communal gatherings were scaled back or avoided entirely. Art and literature of the period reflect this tension between daily life and the ever-present threat of death, portraying scenes of sudden collapse, unexpected grief, and the fragility of human existence. Even music and storytelling were tinged with an awareness of mortality, capturing the anxiety and resilience of communities living under constant threat. Despite the terror, there were moments of quiet adaptation and human ingenuity. Families discovered ways to provide comfort to the sick even when physicians could do little, offering food, water, and gentle care, and creating spaces within homes that minimized exposure for those who remained healthy. Communities established informal networks for sharing information about outbreaks, offering guidance on protective practices, and supporting one another in practical ways. These responses, though limited in their ability to prevent illness, illustrate the resilience and resourcefulness of human societies in the face of unpredictable disaster. The sweeping impact of the disease also extended to demographics and population structures. The sudden deaths of adults in their prime left children orphaned, households fragmented, and communities struggling to maintain essential labor. Agricultural production was disrupted, trade slowed, and urban centers experienced intermittent declines in population density. These demographic shifts, though often invisible at first, contributed to long-term changes in settlement patterns, economic practices, and social hierarchies. Communities were forced to adapt not only to the immediate threat of illness, but to the broader consequences of repeated mortality on family, labor, and governance. Within this environment, human relationships were both strained and strengthened. Fear and uncertainty could create distance between neighbors, family members, and colleagues, as individuals sought to minimize exposure and protect themselves from the invisible threat. Yet, at the same time, bonds were strengthened through acts of care, mutual support, and shared vigilance. Those who survived often became caretakers, teachers, and guides for younger generations, passing on knowledge of symptoms, protective practices, and survival strategies. This transmission of experience helped to stabilize communities, creating networks of resilience that balanced caution with continuity. The unpredictability of the disease also had a profound impact on perception and behavior. People became acutely aware of the fragility of life and the limitations of human control. Ordinary activities, walking through the market, attending a family gathering, or traveling between towns, carried a heightened sense of risk. Clothing, bedding, and food became objects of caution, and routines were modified to minimize exposure. Fear and vigilance became woven into the daily rhythm of life, creating a psychological landscape shaped as much by anticipation of illness as by illness itself. Stories and accounts of survival, miraculous or otherwise, spread through communities and across regions, shaping cultural memory and social norms. Individuals who recovered from the sweating sickness were often treated with a mixture of awe and suspicion, as their survival could not be fully explained. Some were considered fortunate or blessed, while others were viewed with superstition, feared as carriers or as somehow touched by forces beyond human understanding. These narratives contributed to a complex social response, blending practical knowledge, religious interpretation, and folklore. The economic consequences of repeated outbreaks were also significant. Trade routes were disrupted as merchants hesitated to travel, markets and fairs were scaled back, and the labor force was diminished by sudden mortality. Communities struggled to maintain essential functions, from agricultural production to craftsmanship, while adapting to the loss of skilled individuals. Even short-term disruptions could have cascading effects on supply, demand, and the stability of local economies. In this way, the sweating sickness exerted influence not only on health, but on the material foundations of society, shaping the conditions in which communities lived and survived. Religious and philosophical interpretations of the disease provided additional layers of coping and understanding. Clergy and laypeople alike sought to explain the apparent randomness of death, attributing outbreaks to divine punishment, moral failings, or celestial alignment. These explanations, while not scientifically accurate, offered a framework for interpreting events that were otherwise incomprehensible. Rituals of confession, prayer, and penance became intertwined with practical measures of isolation and hygiene, creating a hybrid system of spiritual and social protection. While the effectiveness of such practices in preventing illness was limited, their psychological impact was substantial, providing a sense of agency and meaning in a world otherwise dominated by uncertainty. In the midst of this uncertainty, communities developed adaptive routines and cultural practices to endure. The cyclical nature of outbreaks, periods of relative calm interrupted by sudden waves of illness, required flexibility, resilience, and foresight. Households learned to maintain stores of food and water, care for the sick, and navigate social interactions with heightened caution. Communities established informal communication networks to alert neighbors of outbreaks and share survival strategies. Over time, these practices became ingrained in the social fabric, shaping behavior and expectations long after individual outbreaks had passed. Education and transmission of knowledge became critical. Elders taught children the signs of illness, how to care for family members, and the importance of caution in daily life. Storytelling, often infused with moral lessons or cautionary details, served as a means of reinforcing social norms and preparing younger generations for the realities of living in a world where sudden death could occur without warning. This oral tradition preserved both practical knowledge and cultural memory, ensuring that the lessons learned from each wave of the disease were not lost. Despite the overwhelming fear, human creativity and ingenuity found ways to persist. Craftsmen continued their work, adapting techniques to minimize exposure. Merchants devised safer trade practices. Families innovated in domestic care and hygiene. Even art, music, and literature reflected both the terror and the resilience of the period, capturing the emotional and social consequences of living under the shadow of a swift and merciless illness. These creative responses demonstrate the adaptability of human societies in the face of profound uncertainty and mortality. Ultimately, the legacy of the sweating sickness extended beyond immediate mortality. It reshaped social structures, influenced economic and political systems, and left enduring psychological and cultural effects. Communities that endured learned to navigate the delicate balance between caution and continuity, fear and resilience. Families adapted, knowledge was transmitted, and societies evolved strategies for coping with a threat that could not be fully understood or controlled. In this sense, the sweating sickness was not only a disease of the body, but a profound shaper of the human experience, leaving lessons that extended far beyond the hours or days of its immediate impact. As the final waves of the sweating sickness passed through England and neighboring regions, a lingering sense of unease persisted in the hearts and minds of those who had survived. The disease, having struck with swiftness and unpredictability, had left not only physical loss, but profound psychological scars, shaping the ways in which individuals, families, and communities approached life in the aftermath. People who had witnessed neighbors, friends, and even members of their own households vanish within hours developed an acute awareness of mortality that became woven into their daily existence. It was not merely a memory of death, but an ongoing consciousness that life could change or end at any moment, a realization that colored every decision, every interaction, and every thought. In surviving households, there emerged a deepened sense of caution. Families who had once taken the routines of daily life for granted began to plan with careful attention to detail, anticipating potential disruptions, considering contingency measures, and instilling vigilance in their children. Even simple activities, preparing meals, tending livestock, fetching water, traveling to markets, were approached with awareness of the invisible threat that had previously seemed unimaginable. Parents taught children to recognize the earliest signs of distress, to value personal hygiene, and to observe the subtle symptoms that might precede sudden collapse. This education, though practical, carried an emotional weight, as each lesson was underscored by the stories of relatives, neighbors, and friends who had succumbed unexpectedly. The psychological legacy of the sweating sickness extended beyond the domestic sphere. Communities experienced a reshaping of social interaction, trust, and cooperation. Markets, churches, and public spaces remained cautious hubs, where people maintained social distance and measured contact, fearing that close proximity might once again invite disaster. Public gatherings were approached with wariness, festivities were muted or postponed. Even in moments of communal activity, there was a quiet undercurrent of vigilance, an unspoken recognition that safety could be ephemeral. These adaptations, while subtle, reflected a society profoundly influenced by repeated encounters with mortality, where fear was balanced with the necessity of continuing life. Economically, the impact of the sweating sickness continued to ripple through communities long after outbreaks had subsided. Sudden deaths of laborers, merchants, and artisans disrupted production, trade, and essential services. Fields went untilled, workshops slowed, and trade networks faced interruptions as merchants hesitated to travel. Even after the disease passed, the challenge of rebuilding labor forces, restoring commerce, and maintaining agricultural productivity shaped local economies for months or even years. Households were forced to adapt by reorganizing labor, relying on extended family or neighbors, and prioritizing essential tasks over luxury or convenience. This practical resilience ensured that survival was possible even amid the lingering shadow of fear. The cultural consequences were equally significant. Art, literature, and oral storytelling reflected the heightened awareness of mortality and the fragility of human existence. Chroniclers and writers captured accounts of sudden death, unexpected survival, and the emotional turmoil of families torn apart by the sickness. These narratives provided both documentation and cautionary lessons, preserving the memory of the disease while shaping communal understanding of risk, precaution, and resilience. Music and poetry often carried somber themes, reflecting grief, fear, and the search for meaning in a world where death could arrive without warning. Even humor, when present, was tinged with the awareness of fragility, highlighting the precariousness of human life. Social hierarchies and political structures were reshaped by the abrupt mortality caused by the sweating sickness. Nobles and local leaders who perished unexpectedly left estates and territories without clear succession, prompting disputes over inheritance and leadership. Distant relatives often assumed positions of authority, sometimes with little experience or preparation. Kings and rulers, aware of the vulnerability of even the highest-ranking individuals, modified travel practices, reinforced security measures, and contemplated succession planning with heightened urgency. The disease, in its indiscriminate and sudden nature, demonstrated that human authority, wealth, and preparation could not fully shield against mortality, influencing governance and social organization in ways both subtle and profound. The unpredictability of survival also shaped social perception and superstition. Communities struggled to understand why some individuals survived while others perished. Those who recovered were often regarded with a mixture of awe, suspicion, or reverence. Some were seen as fortunate, blessed by divine favor, while others were believed to carry hidden corruption or supernatural influence. These interpretations influenced behavior, shaping interpersonal relationships, trust, and communal norms. Even as rational explanations for the disease gradually emerged over centuries, the cultural memory preserved these beliefs, blending practical survival knowledge with moral and spiritual interpretations. Family structures were deeply affected. The sudden loss of parents, siblings, or extended relatives left many households fragmented. Children were orphaned, households were forced to reorganize, and traditional roles were disrupted. In some cases, women assumed leadership within households, managing estates, finances, and labor in the absence of male relatives. Children matured quickly, learning responsibilities beyond their years as they adapted to the demands of survival. These shifts had lasting effects on family dynamics, gender roles, and the transmission of knowledge and property within communities. Health practices evolved in response to the lessons of the sweating sickness. Families and communities implemented isolation strategies, improved sanitation where possible, and established routines for monitoring the sick. Though scientific understanding was limited, these measures reflected practical learning and observation, demonstrating the human capacity to adapt behavior to mitigate risk. Advice passed down through generations emphasized vigilance, cleanliness, and attentiveness to early symptoms, blending practical wisdom with cultural and spiritual beliefs. Over time, these practices contributed to a broader understanding of disease prevention, even in the absence of formal medical knowledge. Education, both formal and informal, was shaped by the experience of repeated mortality. Children learned about illness, care for the sick, and the fragility of life through direct observation and oral storytelling. Chroniclers recorded events with meticulous attention, providing lessons for future generations. Knowledge about protective measures, survival strategies, and the importance of hygiene was transmitted alongside cultural narratives and moral instruction. The sweating sickness, in this way, left an educational imprint, influencing both practical skills and ethical perspectives within communities. The emotional consequences of living under the shadow of the sweating sickness were profound. Survivors carried grief, trauma, and anxiety long after outbreaks had passed. Communities commemorated the dead with ceremonies, prayers, and memorials, attempting to provide closure where the suddenness of death had denied it. Memory became a tool for resilience, allowing people to honor lost loved ones while reinforcing social bonds and collective vigilance. Emotional endurance became a necessary component of survival, intertwining grief with daily life, shaping the ways individuals interacted with one another, and influencing decision-making in ways both subtle and profound. Even religious life was transformed. Clergy adapted to the unpredictable nature of the disease, offering guidance on coping with grief, emphasizing moral instruction, and providing rituals that combined spiritual comfort with practical precaution. Communities integrated faith into daily routines in ways that balanced hope with realism, prayer with vigilance, and moral reflection with tangible action. Religious interpretation provided context and meaning for a world in which life could end abruptly, reinforcing cultural norms, ethical behavior, and collective resilience. In addition, the disease influenced mobility and travel. Merchants, pilgrims, and travelers adopted cautious practices, avoiding regions perceived as dangerous, minimizing exposure to crowded spaces, and sometimes establishing informal quarantine measures. The movement of people, goods, and ideas was subtly reshaped by the memory of sudden outbreaks, creating patterns of cautious interaction that balanced necessity with the awareness of risk. These adaptations contributed to the long-term resilience of communities, even as they demonstrated the pervasive impact of mortality on human behavior. Psychologically, survivors carried a heightened sense of fragility and impermanence. The suddenness of death instilled a recognition of vulnerability that permeated daily life. Ordinary routines, eating, sleeping, socializing, were imbued with an awareness of mortality. Even as the immediate threat subsided, the consciousness of uncertainty persisted, influencing personal decisions, social interactions, and cultural expressions. Anxiety, vigilance, and grief became intertwined with the practices of survival, shaping both individual and collective behavior for years beyond the last outbreaks. The cumulative effect of repeated waves of the sweating sickness was the formation of a societal memory, a shared awareness of vulnerability that transcended individual experience. Communities remembered who had survived, who had perished, and what strategies had been employed to endure. This memory was preserved through chroniclers, oral storytelling, artistic representation, and ritual practice, creating a cultural archive of survival, caution, and resilience. Through these records, future generations could learn from the experiences of the past, drawing lessons that extended beyond the immediate moment of crisis. The physical landscape also bore the marks of mortality. Cemeteries expanded, mass graves appeared, and the urban environment reflected the demographic shifts caused by sudden deaths. Streets once bustling became quieter as communities adapted to population loss, and infrastructure had to be adjusted to accommodate the social and economic consequences of mortality. Even architecture and settlement patterns were influenced, as people considered safety, accessibility, and community structure in response to repeated outbreaks. Finally, the legacy of the sweating sickness lies not only in the tangible impacts on population, economy, and governance, but in the enduring impression on the human psyche. The unpredictability, speed, and severity of the disease instilled a deep awareness of mortality, vulnerability, and resilience. People learned to balance caution with continuity, grief with hope, and fear with the necessity of living. Families, communities, and institutions adapted to a world in which life could be snatched away without warning, creating strategies